Hello and welcome to Pockenrop. This is part 2 of my albums that defined me, the ones that really shaped my tastes over the years. And let's dive straight in. We're in around about the year 1990 in my life, and I have a cousin who is a major Bob Dylan fan. And he introduced me to Bob Dylan. He had 2 copies of this album, giving me one of them and said, "You can keep it." And it is Blonde on Blonde. Now, it is an unusual album to listen to Bob Dylan for the first time on, as it contains, as its opening track, Rainy Day Women, numbers 12 and 35, which you just listen to and think, what on earth? And clearly everybody does get stoned. But that was my starting point into Bob Dylan. Now I have grown to like, even love many Bob Dylan albums, with Blood on the Tracks being comfortably my favourite. I think it's an amazingly good album. Blonde on Blonde, I still really have a lot of affection for. Highway 61, but it all started with this. It's the first time I'd come across Bob Dylan, Blonde on Blonde, when I listened to it in 1990. The next album is a compilation. So I have already talked about the Beatles. I've already talked about McCartney's All the Best. Well, in 1990, I got a cassette copy of George Harrison's The Best of Dark Horse. And there were several tracks on there that I grew to absolutely love. I really like the title track, Gone Troppo, and that's a total deep cut that people don't even talk about. And we've got My Mind Set on You. It contains things like Crackerbox Palace and a couple of tracks that have only been released for that compilation, one of which has never been released outside of that compilation, which is Poor Little Girl, which I absolutely love. I think it's a great George song. It was that album from 1990, The Best of Dark Horse, that got me into George in the first place. Moving into the year 1991, and I had on cassette, once again, cassettes are going to come up quite a bit at the moment, Crowded House's Woodface. Bought on the strength of Weather With You and Fall at Your Feet. But there is so much more in the album Woodface. It's not my favourite Crowded House album. That is the follow-up, Together Alone, which is a masterwork. But Woodface was commercial, it was accessible, it was enjoyable, it was full of great songs, and that started my interest in Crowded House, and I own every Crowded House album. Next on my list is another thing that came out in 1991, and it was ubiquitous that year. It was my starting point for REM. It is Out of Time. Again, not my favourite REM album. But this does contain Shiny Happy People, which, as someone who enjoys pop music, was a really good start point. It then contains Near Wild Heaven, which is a sublime song. It started my interest in REM. Again, from around about 91, 92, I had a cassette copy of something called the Kinks Definitive Collection. Now, that was a long time before I started listening to actual Kinks albums, but that was my in point there. Best of the Kinks, every hit single on there, including Come Dancing from 1983. A great singles compilation, another entry point. The next thing on my list, as I walk through my life, is Life of Surprises by Prefab Sprout. So this CD was bought on the strength of the fact that I knew the single The King of Rock and Roll. So this then led to me seeking out this compilation, The Life of Surprises, and this was a real connection point between myself and a friend at university, because we were the only 2 people we knew who had any interest or liked anything by Prefab Sprout. It was like I say, an entry point into Prefab Sprout's canon. And then in 92, again at university, somebody recommended that I gave the Smiths a try. My knowledge of the Smiths, that they were the bunch of miserableists that stunk up the charts in the 80s, and I wasn't interested. But he said they're not all depressing songs. And I ended up buying the Smiths' Best One. Now, I don't still own it. It's not a great compilation, but it is a good entry point with things like Sheila Take a Bow and This Charming Man, two songs which I absolutely adore still to this day. And I have owned every single Smiths album at some point. Less interested in some of them now, but the Smiths started as a result of Best One. In my final year at university in 1995, I was introduced to the band Moxie from Canada and their debut album, Bargainville. I love Bargainville. I have, again, owned most of their albums at some point. And their blend of comedic songs, but also some very deep lyrics and the styles of their melodies, I love Moxie Fruvus. Moving on a further year, when I was at Warwick University, I discovered this band, DC Talk, and the album Jesus Freak. This was the first Christian album that I bought that didn't suck in some way or was viewed as being a bit lame. This is a banging rock album, and it's really, really good. It stands up today as a work. Jesus Freak by DC Talk, it featured in my top albums of the 90s. It was a seminal album for me in Christian music and in my life. Fast forward now to the kind of end of the decade, about 98, 99, and I decided to start listening to some different styles of music, and one of them was the Best of the Songbooks by Ella Fitzgerald, an album so good that I bought my mum a copy, and she loves it too. It's an absolutely wonderful entry point to the singing in the style of Ella Fitzgerald. Fast forward to 2001, 2002, and a film came out called Almost Famous. And there's a track on there by Elton John called Tiny Dancer. This led to me reconsidering my, not exactly dismissal of Elton John, but my knowledge of him as a singles artist. Now, I did own the very best of Elton John from 1990, but I'd sold it. It never really burrowed in, but this did. Madman Across the Water by Elton John. One of his lowest selling albums, but it does contain Tiny Dancer, and every track on it is fantastic. This was my real hook point for Elton. Madman Across the Water. 2004, and a band came along who I only bought this based on the fact that it came top in Q's top 50 albums of 2004, Hopes and Fears. And then as I was getting to know my now wife, I remember listening to this album on the M5 and thinking, this is phenomenal. I still adore every single song on Hopes and Fears to this day. And I so am looking forward to finally getting to see Keane live next year from this year's cancelled gig at Cannock Chase. Hopes and Fears, entry point to Keane, absolutely fantastic album. Sticking with albums that came out in 2004, this one I didn't really listen to for 5 years and now is amongst my all-time favourite albums, American Idiot by Green Day. My entry point into Green Day, a band I now love. I've seen American Idiot Broadway show and it's brilliant. My penultimate entry on this list is an album that when I heard it, or when I heard the title track, I kind of said, where has this been all my life? And it is I Want to See the Bright Lights Tonight by Richard and Linda Thompson. I first heard this in 2015 and I'd heard other Richard Thompson songs. I'd heard a Richard Thompson compilation and it had never grabbed me. But when I heard this song, it opened up the whole of Richard Thompson to me. I Want to See the Bright Lights Tonight is a fantastic album and an amazingly good song. And then finally, we come right up to date with 2020 and an album that has surprised me beyond almost anything else I've heard. Folklore by Taylor Swift. I'm not saying I'm a Swiftie, but I am interested in her music as a result. So that concludes the albums that have shaped my tastes. I'd love to know what you think. Maybe open up some new things to me. Let me know in the comments below. But until next time, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications, and I'll see you in a week.